Hello, everyone. My name is Fisher Derderian, and I am the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you today, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world, to the next interview in our series, Rooted: Cultivating a Green Philosophy. At the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, we were established back in 2020 to advance the legacy of Sir Roger Scruton through the care, cultivation, and continuation of humane wisdom and culture through the Western tradition. We do this through a series of online interviews, through in-person lectures, conferences, and other events. And so it's with that in mind that we started this series, Rooted, last summer. We did one interview. We had the wonderful Mary Berry, president of the Berry Center and daughter of Wendell Berry, the great agrarian essayist and novelist. And I'm so excited to continue this series for the coming months, and starting today with a wonderful interview with the great James Rebanks. Before we get into that, though, I'm also pleased to announce that we are starting this interview series, or rather continuing this interview series, in the partnership with the Wethersfield Institute, which is another wonderful organization. And it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Budnick, the president and chair of the organization. Peter is also a professional architect, and in his free time has 7 children that he takes care of. But we're really excited to work with Peter and Wethersfield in bringing this series to you. So I'd like to give Peter just a minute to introduce himself and introduce what he's doing at Wethersfield. Peter.
Fisher, thank you for the introduction. I'll try to keep it brief. The Wethersfield Institute is thrilled to be partnering with the Scruton Legacy Foundation on this Rooted series. Through our founder, Chauncey Stillman, the Institute has a rich history in exploring many of the themes that Sir Roger probed in his work on green philosophy and oikophilia. In the late 1930s, Stillman helped found a magazine called Free America, which gave an outlet to some of the leading decentralist and distributist thinkers of the day. Stillman also created an estate and farm, which he called Wethersfield, that wove together biodynamic farming and land conservation with formal landscape design and residential architecture that housed the classical art collection of new and old works. In 1984, Chauncey Stillman founded the Wethersfield Institute, for which he appropriated the logo from Free America, through which he promoted a deeper understanding of the ancient Roman Catholic Church in America, which he considered the wellspring of much of Western civilization. The Wethersfield Institute was pleased to call Sir Roger a friend in the last few years of his life, and enjoyed a memorable several days in early autumn of 2018 when he visited Wethersfield and enjoyed all the fruits of Chauncey Stillman's physical legacy, even participating in the equestrian heritage of the area. Finally, Sir Roger contributed the preface to Land and Liberty, Best of Free America, the collection of essays from Free America, edited by Alan Carlson. We are grateful for the continued friendship of the Scruton Legacy Foundation and are looking forward to deepening the contributions that Chauncey Stillman and Sir Roger Scruton made to our understanding of being rooted in both time and place. With that said, I give you your Rooted series host, Grace Olmstead, the author of Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. She has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, among other outlets.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's just a delight and an honor to get to talk to you all today and to get to talk about issues that matter so much to us in our current moment and throughout the world. In this series, we are considering what it means to steward local ecology and local communities well, and to address the crises of climate change, of rampant waste, soil degradation, and water pollution through a local and a particular lens. Sir Roger Scruton once suggested that the dire environmental challenges of our time must be attended to in and through our love of home. So in this series, we're conversing with farmers, writers, community organizers, and thinkers who have embodied that love of home in tangible ways. Each has adopted practical measures to steward their places well, and each has engaged in works of advocacy and writing to larger audiences on these issues of stewardship and care. Our guest today, James Rebanks, is a best-selling author and farmer from the Lake District in the north of England. His autobiographical book, The Shepherd's Life, was published in 2015. It quickly became a Sunday Times bestseller and has been translated into, I believe, 16 languages at least. His second book, English Pastoral, received the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing in 2021. Over the years, James has become an advocate both within the UK and in the larger world for methods of regenerative agriculture that heal soil, strengthen farms, and bolster communities. So I'm delighted to talk to him today about his work and vision and how both have developed over time. James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, I wish I dressed a little bit more smartly, but I've been feeding my sheep. That's my life. So yeah.
It's a perfect balance. And I'm so glad that we are able to do this and have this conversation in different areas of the world and in very different time zones. You have a busy life. And so I'm grateful that you're able to take the time. So first, my first question for you is, how would you describe your environmental ethic, or basically what values or principles undergird your vision of what stewardship should look like on your farm?
That's a good, deceptively simple question, isn't it? I think my starting point in answering that is I grew up in a very traditional farming family, stroke community, and I had my family at that time had a very strong patriarch, which was my grandfather. Now, not everything was perfect about that. I'm sure there's elements of my grandmother's life that we could very easily critique. The way he was with my grandmother, we would easily critique. But the good side of him, if you like, was he had this really strong set of ethics, which were not unlike those you'd read in a Wendell Berry book. And I was actually in my mid-30s before friends persuaded me to read Wendell Berry. Somehow I'd managed not to. And other writers like that. And it was like reading, I found my granddad in books again. So it was a very sort of Wendell Berry-esque old farming world set of ethics. And I remember being really surprised in my 20s when I realized that to other people, economists and politicians, farmers were meant to be profit-seeking, rational economic actors. And that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the world that I'd grown up in, where people were actually doing things because they loved them, or because they'd always done them, or because everybody else did them. There was very little innovation or novelty in that world. You lived the lives that your people had always lived. You did the work with the seasons as you always had. It wasn't that nothing had changed. There were tractors and there were sort of beginnings of sort of quite modern machinery in that landscape, but certainly the worldview and the ethics was a sort of peasant European mentality, really. We'd been there forever. We always would be there. And all that you had to do was to keep working, keep being honest, keep being a good neighbor to the people around you, and somehow it would all be okay. And it was only later when I saw that world sort of disintegrating around me in my 20s and 30s that I was like, oh, okay, this is not how the rest of the world operates. These are clearly not the dominant values of our age. And yeah, I'm 49 now, but I was probably well into my 30s before I felt any kind of urge to talk about any of these things. I'd just lived it prior to that. And it was only when I saw it falling around sort of disintegrating around my ears, that I began to realize that just simply being what we were was now a radical act. You had to actually stand out of the flow, step off the escalator, whatever the metaphor is. And you had to go the other way. You had to go, actually, I'm not doing that anymore. That's not right. Yeah, and in my books, I've sort of detailed that journey, which is the sort of growing awareness that what the market was asking you to do, or what politicians were asking you to do, was actually destroying things of value. So the other thing about my granddad's worldview is he wouldn't have destroyed a field and then said, oh, but I made a profit. Like, he would never have done that. There were things you didn't do. It was just ingrained in us that there were things you would not do. And one of them was in any way degrading your land or cheating any of your neighbors in any way. In fact, they're quite suspicious of making a profit out of each other. It wasn't something you wanted to overly conspicuously do. And yeah, that was the world I grew up in, really. And I didn't think anything of it for most of the first 20-something years of my life. It was just what we were.
How would you describe your place in the Lake District? I know you talk about this quite a bit in The Shepherd's Life, which is a lovely book, but this is a place, unlike much of the current agricultural models in the US, this is a place where farmers have followed a tradition of agriculture that's existed for thousands of years. In some instances, it seems. So if you could describe a little bit about the Lake District and how long you've lived there and why and how you've seen agriculture develop there.
So you guys can't see it, but I've got the computer set on a pile of books, and behind it, I'm looking out of some windows onto the mountains, basically. So the Lake District is a very poor, historically very poor, very disconnected from the rest of the UK place. To get here, now you would go down a sort of 6-lane highway, up 3 lanes either way. But in the past, you had to actually go through the sea at low tide over the sands to get to Cumbria. It was so isolated. So it's a sort of, because of mountains on one side and the sea, sort of tidal zone on the south, very isolated until the 18th century. And you have a very distinct culture in that place. And it's all about, it was a very Norse culture originally. A lot of the valleys were settled by Viking people. A lot of my farming friends, if you see them, will have like big bushy ginger beards, or long before it was cool to do that in London or New York. People are sort of rocking beards and look like they've just got off a Viking boat, even if they happen to be wearing like a North Face jacket or something. And a lot of the dialect, so we call a mountain a fell. In Norway, they call it a fjell. We call a stream a beck. In Norway, they call it a beck. We say, our dialect, if we were going home, would say we're ganyam. It's pure Norwegian. If you say that in London, they've got no idea what you're talking about. So culturally, in many ways, we're more aligned with places we've had no contact with for 1,000 years further north. And the actual landscape, the defining characteristics are that it was not enclosed like most of modern Britain or most of Europe. There's lots of common land, the biggest area of common land in Western Europe. And that is maintained to this day, and it has a profound impact on the people and the way that they interact with each other. So the mountains, my private farm, my family's private farm, it's not mine, it's my family's, is a piece of private land. But we have rights to take sheep onto a common on the mountains, like a seasonal grazing in a certain place. And you have to do it in a certain way. And to take those sheep from the mountain, we have to work with 10 or 12 other shepherds or shepherdesses. We have to go at the same time. We have to use the sheepdogs together. So apart maybe from like an ATV, like a quad bike or something, the things that we're doing are exactly the same things as people were doing here 1,000 years ago. And that creates a certain kind of people. There's very little social hierarchy here historically. Nobody was rich enough to be better than you. And it's a sort of, historically was a culture where if you did your work, looked after your land, looked after your sheep, you were as good as anybody. Now, technically, there's some feudal aristocrat 30 miles away that owns the mountain that you've got squatters grazing rights on, but that guy or woman never appeared in your life. So it's a very sort of egalitarian, very blunt, northern, very simple, quite democratic culture that we're from. And again, it's only when you experience the other that you realize what you are, isn't it? So it's taken me the last 20 years to be able to contextualize that. But I have farming friends here that we only live 3 hours by train from London. They've never been to London. They've got no interest in going to London. This is their world, and everything that they need is here. And I'm slightly jealous of them. I'm not sure why I've ever been to London, but never mind. We'll hey ho. So that's what it is. So behind the screen from you, we have these mountains that are common land. Beneath that, you have this sort of half and half land, which are called allotments or intakes. And then in the valley bottom, you have the private fields. And I could talk for hours about how those things interact. And you can only put as many sheep onto the mountain as you can winter on your private fields in the valley bottom. So it was Eleanor, I forget her name, the Swedish lady that won the Nobel Prize for work about commons, Ahlström.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So she wrote some amazing things about how local communities learn how to self-regulate their environments. This is one of the best case studies you can look at. And the sad thing here is that the more integrated into the modern world we get, the more corrupted all of that becomes, the less well that begins to work, the more we try to scrape every last penny, every last pound out of it. And the further we get from those traditional values, which weren't perfect, but they worked in certain ways. And yeah, particularly since the Second World War, that world has shrunk and contracted and got corrupted, and all sorts of things have happened to it. But it's still there, not far beneath the surface. I could take you in a car from my house, and I could take you to people that would still, just like my grandfather was 50 years ago, still interact with other people around them according to those values. Yeah, it's still there. It's remarkably resilient. But I think I heard a sociologist once talking about switching codes, how people can have two cultures. You have the culture where you go to work, you're the same as everybody else, you watch the same TV show yesterday. You learn how to switch into that dominant narrative and culture. But you also have another culture that you go home to, and sometimes when journalists are with me, they'll burst out laughing because I'll talk to them like I'm talking to you in one version of my voice, and then I'll stop the car to talk to a neighboring farmer, and suddenly my dialect and everything changes, and they go, what the heck did you just say? And I'm like, okay, I switched codes. They're my people. I was being polite and trying to communicate with you. So that's my world, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I noticed that's really remarkable too is that because of the way in which this farm community has really evolved over time, you've managed to hold on to a lot of communal and collaborative methods of farming that have died out in other parts of the world. In the US, there's been a really big push to kind of reconsider collaborative farming and looking at indigenous practices of farming that existed for millennia, looking at examples like civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer started a collaborative farm in the South, in addition to the other work that she did. And there's a lot of people drawing on these patterns of collaborative farming in the US, but you guys have done it and you've kept doing it for quite some time. And how is it that you think the Lake District has kept those rhythms of kind of communal collaborative farming strong?
So the truth is, it's the most, perhaps you should use this word. It was one of the poorest and most backward places in Britain. So when modernity is happening, it gets to us last. We're the last bit of England it gets to. So, and we kind of got, historically and culturally, we got lucky in this area, which is most of England had been enclosed over the preceding 200 years. By the time enclosure got to this landscape, it was sort of halfway through happening when other voices became powerful. The voices of Wordsworth and others who said, whoa, hang on a minute. Maybe we don't want to do this everywhere. Maybe these big open spaces, maybe this the way that these people live, maybe this matters. Just like stop with that. You've done that everywhere else. Just stop here. And so that's one of the reasons there was a sort of big cultural, legal battles and intellectual battles that stopped some of those processes happening here just in time for it to remain. And then if you have these big open mountain areas where lots of people have very ancient legal rights to graze, they're going to keep on grazing unless you stop them, basically. So we've just kept going right through to the current day. And I think the real challenge is maybe coming in the next 20 years. So in Britain, and certainly Britain when it was part of the European Union, there have been mechanisms to support this kind of thing. There have been, so we could align with farmers in the Pyrenees or the Carpathians or somewhere else with similar traditions. And there was enough of us around Europe to raise enough of a voice to say, actually, maybe we want to support that. There's enough public value in that to support it. Now, I mean, I don't want to get into politics too much, but as a result of Brexit and the political changes after that, we may well be in a political situation where the people governing us have no interest in that. It may actively be hostile towards it and don't remotely care with any kind of nostalgia or sentimentality about what might happen if you let that world fall apart. And yeah, so arguably, I'm not sure. This may be about to die. And I never felt that until recently, but it's going to come under severe pressure. And there's also other battles happening here now, because suddenly people are looking at mountains and saying, well, actually, I'd like to plant a forest on it and trap all of the carbon and be paid for that. Or I'd like that to be wilderness, thank you very much. Now, some of that, and some of those are benign voices, people who want to do good in the world, and some of them, to be blunt, are crooks who want to displace their damage elsewhere by buying off some quite poor people in the mountains. And you're like, whoa, personally, I want to disentangle that. I don't want to deal with crooks, and I want to unpack that a little bit and work out what that is before I personally am involved in those changes. So, yeah, it's an interesting time we live in.
It would be interesting to talk about some of the things that you are doing practically, involving tree planting to really restore and give health back to the land where you live. But I did want to read a quote from The Shepherd's Life because it fits into this vision of kind of both looking at the past and building on it, but also doing things with it that are sometimes new and different. In The Shepherd's Life, you wrote of your grandfather, "I hear his voice in my head when I do work on the farm. It sometimes stops me doing something foolish, and I pause and do it how he would have done it. Everyone knows he was a major ingredient in the making of me, and that I am the going on of him." It's one of my favorite sections in that book. How has that relationship with your granddad continued to influence your farming and your writing?
Okay, so I'm going to answer a slightly different question. So I've had a complicated relationship with my grandfather in the last 15 years, right? So I grew up idolizing him, thinking he's brilliant. But bear in mind, I'm not a boy asking many questions of that world, right? Now we live in a different world, right? Where you say, whoa, hang on a minute. Did my granddad and grandma have a nice marriage? Was this man who I've idolized, was he a good father? Was there a downside to that guy? And the truth is, yes, I think there was. So as I'm getting older, I think in some ways I'm moving away from my hero. I'm thinking, I've got 4 kids and I'd like to be a little bit of a better father than maybe he was to my dad. And I certainly want to be a better husband to my wife than he was to my grandmother. I know things that are not particularly nice. Not terrible, but not that nice. And so in some ways I've moved away from him. But in terms of his farming ethics, I feel like there's a huge amount of continuity through my grandfather and my dad and myself. So this morning, I have a friend who actually lives in London, but has always wanted to own some land, been lucky enough to have a successful career in another field, and then approached me a couple of years ago and said, can we work together? If I buy a piece of land, really degraded, spoiled land, could we together, like, put together a team of people to mend it, do everything good that we can think of to mend that piece of land? So we've been working on it for a couple of years. He owns 66 acres of land not far from my farm. So I spent all this morning with a fencing contractor and a guy who knows how we can access some government funding for environmental projects. And we're beginning a process of putting new hedgerows back on there, putting shelter belts where we can plant maybe 30,000 trees around this place, redesigning it, doing things to help a lot of rare plants that need cattle-only grazing and long rests in the summer. So what we're doing there really is taking my grandfather's idea of what a field was for, and then bringing in some other ideas about ecology or soil science or the best new thinking on grazing, and trying to take it forward. Not so I can copy my grandfather, which I think is quite limited because he was a man of his own time, but so that if my grandfather came back now and learned all of the things that I've learned, we could have a sensible conversation. I think it's not copying some mythical, nostalgic golden age, but asking, okay, what would he have done if he knew what I know? I think that's the test. And he didn't know anything about rivers particularly, or hydrology, about how water is meant to move about a landscape. He probably didn't know much about soil health. He certainly didn't know much about how to optimize photosynthesis by really clever regenerative planned grazing. That's a bit nerdy, but he didn't. And I do. I spent 10, 15 years learning those things. So I'm not trying to be him. I'm trying to be him, the sort of plus version of him. And probably my kids and grandkids will come along and realize how limited I was, that I didn't know half a dozen things that they will. And they'll probably have all sorts of problems with me as a person. But that's okay. That's the game, right? We get to do what's in front of us and be as good, as wise, as productive as we can be. That's it, right? There's nothing... and we'll all get it a bit wrong, but we do our best.
It is interesting because I wrote a book about, in many ways, my great-grandfather and grandfather and the way they farmed. And as I researched it and wrote it, my grandfather started to tell me things about my great-grandfather that were just very interesting and critical in a loving way. One of those being that he was so determined to do things his way, and such a kind of independent man that he refused to work with others oftentimes. And so he didn't teach them the things that he knew or why he did the things he did. And so my grandfather and father both ended up wondering, why did he do this random thing? And of course, as I started to research and study it, often there were good reasons to do that thing. But it is interesting how some of his struggles as a person made it so that those traditions didn't get handed on. All that to say, I think we both have wonderful heroes we look to, and as we grow older, we can see the heroes are still human, and we have a lot to learn from both their mistakes and their strengths. Yeah.
I think so, and I think if they're worthy of that respect, then even if you could bring them by a time machine back, they would be big enough to accept all of that, right? You'd hope so. And if they weren't big enough to be that, well, we shouldn't really be making heroes of them, should we? I think for a big turning point in my life was having my own children, and now my own children becoming teenagers and starting to get involved in the farm. And that's really teaching me a lot as well. So I think even until 2 or 3 years ago, somewhere deep in my head, I think I'm the old patriarch who never leaves, right? You live there till you die, you're the boss. And doesn't this reflect well on me, this heroic sort of landscape around me that hopefully I'll create? And I've now got a 16-year-old daughter called B who helps me on the farm all the time. She wants to run the farm, and she's very good, and she's very switched on. And it just hit me like a wave a couple of years ago. I thought, oh, hang on a minute. If I don't get out the way, I'm the stupid old fool that makes her less than she can be, that limits her life, that stops her growing. And I've sort of completely flipped now. I'm like, okay, I don't really want to ever stop coming to the farm. I don't really ever want to miss the sunrise or working with my sheepdogs or seeing the flock of sheep. I'll probably do that until I die. But I think I might be a better man if I try to get out of it quite a lot of the time and make enough space for her to be the boss in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years, maybe. It's funny, isn't it? Life comes at you fast. You think you've got it worked out. You think you've got a narrative that makes sense, a theory of control. And then suddenly life hits you in the face and you think, oh, maybe I need to be better than that. So that's what we're working on at the moment. I'm trying to work out how I can be the best enabler of her starting, not some silly old fool getting in the way because he's got this strange hero narrative in his head.
It's an interesting question. I think the handing down of farms and kind of the question of how do you involve the next generation and help them kind of join in the work and the vision and then eventually hand over the reins to them has often been quite tricky. And so I'd love to hear how you are thinking about that and what it looks like even practically right now to do that sort of work.
Looks like you've got some good help there.
I do.
Good. Hello to little person. It's a miracle. It's only because I'm in a different building that I get to escape that. I'm up in the barn. So I read or saw somebody say this thing a while ago, which is that basically you did your job if you run a business or a farm, if you make it go, if you pass it on, basically. If you pass on something that works to somebody else, whether a complete stranger who buys your business or whether it's your children, you did an exceptional job if the thing works. And I think the real tragedy of the decline of a lot of family farms is that there's nothing viable to hand on, or there's a diminishing thing being handed on. And that makes it very hard for anybody to be noble and pass anything on because it's getting smaller, it's getting more desperate. It takes all of our time, but there isn't enough money for two of us. Like that's a tricky situation for people to act noble in. I actually never loved my farming as much as I love it now because I feel like I'm doing good farming, maybe for the first time in my life, that really makes sense. And I feel like I know what I'm doing. But my goals really shifted to this thing. Can I? And it's not even that I want my daughter to take on exactly my farm and my practices. I'm thinking my focus for the last 3 or 4 years has been, can we develop a way of farming that actually isn't a failing thing, that makes money? I didn't used to be somebody that cared about that, but I think it's a very practical consideration. Can we find a way that's ecologically good, that scales in a good way, that fits into the ecology of this place, where my daughter can make a reasonable wage? And if we can crack that, then we don't need to worry about this little farm that I'm sitting on with my wife, and which will be hard for me to leave, and where my 3 other children live and love at the moment. We can do something different. We can go to another piece of land confidently and say, okay, either we buy this, borrow money and buy it, or we can rent it from somebody else, and my daughter can begin her life and her journey less encumbered with me. She doesn't have to carry me along on her back. She's sort of 10 years away from going, I got this, Dad. I've got this. This works ecologically. I'm making money. I don't need to look back. I can look forwards and move and go. And that's where my head is. And the really exciting thing about the changes on our farm are, and I always butt up against people's perceptions on this. People think if you're a successful writer, that must be financially propping your farm up if you're doing different things. And it's actually the opposite. For the first time in my life, I earned some good money when I had success with the books. Do you think I wanted to throw that money into a bucket with a hole in the bottom? No way. I want to actually look after my kids long term. So what it forced me to do was to value our time much more highly. Time's usually not valued at all by farmers. And then to ask really difficult questions of the farm. Why is it losing money? Is that everybody else's fault? Is that politicians' fault, blah, blah, blah? Or actually, is it just my job to make it work, whatever happens? And I think it is. It's my job, whatever horrid setup they create around us, I think it's my job and will be my daughter's job still to make it work. And that's a hell of a thing to put on farmers, stacking the odds against them and then say, still make it work. But we found a way to do that. And we've basically opted out of a lot of modern agriculture. We buy almost nothing on the farm. We've opted out almost entirely out of using any kind of machinery. That's the big killer, right? So you see these farmers, you think, oh, wow, they're incredibly rich. They've got a 250,000 pound rig with a tractor and a seed drill and blah, blah, blah. Or the combine now costs $1 million or whatever. You're like, oh, wow, they're rich. They're not rich. They're running faster and faster and faster to stand still. They end up with nothing. I saw this amazing stat from Canada about 3 years ago, where some economist had worked out over a 20-year period what percentage of farm turnover had ended up in the farmers' pockets as pure profit. It was -1 or 2. There was no money out of this system for farmers, real money. They're all working sub what they should be get paid to prop up an insane system that's really benefiting John Deere and banks and financiers of loans and other things. It's madness. So our farming system now is all about what we can produce from the natural resources of the farm, which we maximize by looking after it better. So the soil on our farm, the organic matter was down to 13%, which is very high globally, but here it should be more like 19 to 21%. So we're finding that when we do the right things to put the organic matter back in the soil, suddenly those fields are transformed and are way more productive. But that's productive without buying synthetic fertilizers, without using machinery hardly ever, without using pesticides and insecticides. And then there's an amazing thing with that, which is that when you get your soil healthy and you're grazing right, often it's 30 to 40% more productive than what you were doing before, because everything's so degraded. So there's a sort of irony in this, which is that if you can get to that place, you might actually be more naturally productive without all of that costly inputs. And there's a lot to unpack there and question, I guess. But I'll just tell you one thing. For the last 3 years, we've made the best profit on the farm as a standalone business that we've ever made. And my mum, who's a sleeping partner in the business, rang me up last year when we got the farm accounts and said, I'm not always entirely sure what you're doing or why, but keep doing it, right? Like it works. And I made a joke, like I dismissed it out of hand. I said I made a joke. And my mum said, no, don't do that. Don't joke it away. You actually did a lot of things which were uncomfortable. You put loads of work in. No one thought you were doing the right thing, your neighbors and stuff, and it works. She was like, no, I don't want to hear that. Like, don't do the silly joke thing. Just keep going. Be brave. Keep doing it. And that's where we're at, really. I think there is a way out of this, both at the micro scale and at the sort of big. I'm quite depressed about the politics of our age, particularly about the politics of farming and land and the economics of it. But I'm not depressed on a small scale about what we can do on our farms. I think we can stop buying their stuff. I think we can just opt out of it. Not everybody. There may well be a farmer listening to this that's millions of pounds worth into debt, that has a chicken contract with Cargill or whoever. Do I know exactly how they get out of that hole? No, I'm not sure. But many of us can take control of this by opting out of it, by doing things differently. And I think it's going to happen because the other farming doesn't care. It doesn't care about farmers. It doesn't care about you as a consumer. It's utterly, utterly nasty and ruthless. And yeah, I mean, I listened to a little podcasting, a very conventional podcasting from Iowa, I think it is. And they were talking the other day about how they couldn't keep up on their farms. These are huge, big modern farms. Couldn't keep up with the escalating price of machinery. Like it's $1 million combine, and then it's $1.5 million combine somewhere very soon, and you just have to keep accruing more and more acres to try and pay for this. But the people buying your stuff are not fools. They know what the cost of production is. They don't want to pay you a penny a cent over that. So you're just building this pressure and this debt, and the whole thing's ecologically unsustainable anyway. That's not even debatable anymore. Our soils are degraded, our groundwater is poisoned. The Gulf of Mexico has that huge dead zone in it. You just have to look at the Mississippi, right? The whole it's like a brown, sludgy mess, right? Rivers aren't meant to be brown. That's the topsoil floating away. The wealth of America floating away every day, every hour of the day. It's insane. It's insane. I didn't set out to be this person. I'm saying these things, fighting these fights. But you have to. You have to. If you have any shred of decency and goodness in you, as Wendell Berry discovered long before I did, you have to see it and you have to call it and you have to do whatever you can to get out of it and get your people out of it and your community out of it. And I believe that wholeheartedly. So we've planted 36,000 trees. We put miles of hedgerow back in. We've got our soil organic matter from 13% back to 18% in 5 years of transition of the grazing. The farm makes money. And then other crazy things happen, right? When you find your own inner courage to do something different, suddenly your daughter pops up alongside you and says, I believe in this too. Let's go. Let's step it up. And one of the nicest things that's ever happened in my life is we now have lots of other farmers come to the farm and they're like, okay, what is this? What is this thing that you're doing? Because we're in a mess. Like we're in a grim financial mess, and ecologically it's wrecked. What are these things that you're doing? And that's not because I'm a genius. I'm just a little bit ahead of them on the curve. But you can walk them around my farm and go, okay, this is how you build soil carbon. This is how you outwinter cows instead of putting them in a shed. This is how you farm without synthetic fertilizer. And don't take it from me because I'm sort of some weird writing farmer bloke with a little bit of charisma. Just look at it yourself, right? Look at the field. Look at the results. Fetch a spade, dig it up. Look at the data. Don't do anything because I say you should do it. And what we're finding is that farmers come and they go, oh, I thought this was scary. This was too complicated. This was impossible. And then they'll say things like, and now I've met you and you're deeply average, I think I could do it.
Oh my goodness. I wanted to remind folks, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A box and we will take some time to answer them and discuss them. While you guys think of any questions that you might have, I will quickly ask one. So you've talked about Wendell Berry, who really responded to Earl Butz and a change in the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 20th century, in which Earl Butz and others said, we need to get big or get out. We need to expand. We need to industrialize. And this is the future. And of course, as you just pointed out, that had a lot of hugely detrimental consequences that we are reaping and seeing the fruits of in our own age. But you also talk in your book, English Pastoral, about Jane Jacobs, who was a voice for communities in neighborhoods in the 20th century that were often being demolished in the United States. And I just wanted to read this quote because I thought it was really thought-provoking for me as someone who loves Jacobs. And I love the tie that you make here. It has long been recognized, thanks to writers like Jane Jacobs, that cities and towns that are too specialized, too monocultural, too modern, or too fossil fuel reliant work less well in practice than diverse places with a mix of old and new. The new and the old cross-fertilize in all sorts of unforeseen ways. The same is true of agriculture. Rather than making the old farming and crop species and farm animal varieties obsolete, the most intensive farming needs them for its very survival. The most intensive agriculture on Earth relies heavily on the genetic diversity provided by the older farming systems, breeds, and crops. Far from being anachronistic and obsolete, the world's most backward farmers are a vital resource pool for the future. So my question for you is, how is a farm like a neighborhood, like a good, well-functioning neighborhood in the way that Jacobs kind of writes about?
I think it's exactly the same. She sits on my desk all the time, Rachel Carson, and actually she had Robert Moses, right? She had Robert Moses as Earl Butts in this scenario. I think the same arrogance is at work in rural areas as it was in the urban areas that Jane Jacobs was fighting with, and the arrogance is we can do this better than history. We can do it better than nature. We could even do it whatever the hell people think, because we're sort of big, powerful male figures. And there's a hubris to this. We can kill all the bugs in the field by using insecticide. Problem solved. And of course, what Rachel Carson does is she pops up as a biologist and says that makes zero sense, because you won't kill every bug in the field. There'll be two left, and they'll breed, and they'll be a little bit more resistant to the insecticide. So you better come back with a better poison in 2 years' time. So this thing just becomes worse. I think it's the same arrogance as Robert Moses when he says, look, I don't care what the hell people think they're doing in all these neighborhoods and villages of New York. Well, this is the age of the car. Knock it down. Right? Put these huge highways through. And of course, the smart response to that we now know was actually that'll just result in more cars. That'll result in huge amounts of pollution. That will have a truly terrifying cost in terms of the destructions of neighborhoods and communities. And by the way, people don't want to live in these big sort of brutalist, modernist constructions where there's no eyes on the street, where there's no diversity, where there's no, what do you call them, mom and pop stores, and like all this sort of economic diversity. That's where the health of the city comes from. And that's definitely where the health of a farm comes from. So one of the things we're trying to do on our farm is, I think the scientists call it biomimicry, right? There shouldn't be vast monocultures of anything. There isn't in nature. It doesn't exist. The nearest you could get might be something like a desert or a prairie. But a prairie, of course, isn't one thing. It was hundreds and hundreds of species and hundreds of different natural processes. But the idea you can wipe that away and just grow corn and soy and have some chicken and pig sheds on the edge of town, that's insanity. That does not work. And I could give you 20 reasons why it doesn't work. But you have to fight nature to keep that going. And we now know it's both in the urban version of this sort of metaphor and in the rural version, it's disastrous. It isn't that we don't need change. We quite often might need change. And it isn't that all technology is wrong. It's that we have to do something more intelligent, right? And I know Wendell Berry at a few times in his writing career has written about the Amish. Not because the Amish are a perfect model of how to construct a society, but there's at least one interesting thing about the Amish, which is having conversations, collective conversations about new technologies and how they will affect your community. And one thing particularly modern American economics says is that we don't have that conversation. The market will decide. And if if this new thing comes in and breaks things, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's called creative destruction. And so if you talk to like Silicon Valley people, they use the word disruption or destruction as a positive thing. They've literally come in and smashed everything. And I think the future will look back on that in a very critical way. We'll say, hang on a minute, we needed to talk about these things. We didn't need to let these technologies, these things run amok and destroy. Yes, in some cases, people are a little bit perhaps too comfy in the status quo, but mostly they're destroying things in a bad way. Like, are we really not meant to have are we really not going to have a conversation about AI and the fact that people are building machines that will kill many, many people? We're already seeing it in places like Ukraine, right? We're halfway there already. So we've got drones with heat-seeking technology on them that now kill people. We're literally the tiniest technological hop away from those machines killing people without people pressing the trigger. Like, seriously, historically, we're not going to have a conversation about that. We're not allowed to say no to that. We're not allowed to put a crowbar through the machine. We're not allowed to turn it off. I think we're insane right now. And it's this mad hubristic idea that every technology is a good one, that every technology should be allowed to run through our lives, destroy our jobs, destroy our communities. I say no. Or I say, at best, a qualified yes. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about these things. Let's regulate these things. And yeah, I have a huge amount of respect for many of the Scandinavian countries. I'm not sure that I agree that all solutions would be small and local. I think we might need a quite Scandinavian approach to government, to regulation, to putting the lid back on Pandora's box sometimes. So right across the Scandinavian countries, they've got lots of interesting laws about how big farms can get, how many numbers of cattle and sheep you can keep on a unit, how you manage land, whether you can commodify land and sell it as a free tradable asset. I personally think we might have to go into some of that territory. But that's certainly in the American Midwest, that would be one hell of a battle, because you've got now rural communities absolutely invested in the systems that are destroying them, and in a set of values often, and politics that's destructive and going to destroy their lives ultimately. And you have the insanity of anybody rural or in farming voting for somebody like Trump. It's like, well, what, it's madness. Does that person care? Really care about anybody on a small farm? No way. No way. And I'm not saying the other side of that political choice is perfect either. I mean, one of the most horrifying things I learned when I started looking around the world at this is that you're what we would call a sort of minister for agriculture in our government, I forget, the Secretary of State or their advisors, the same handful of companies chuck money at both of your political parties. So whoever wins, they name their own. They choose. They buy. The guy or the woman that sits at the table that makes the decisions about American food and farming is bought. And they're bought both ways. It's incredible. And yeah. And you probably tell I'm basically an agrarian radical in the Wendell Berry mold. I think he's right. And right in a way that is deeply admirable, because it's decades before I worked this stuff out. He's absolutely right. Why would a country that founded itself with very agrarian values, that cared deeply about agrarian things, why would it allow itself to become this thing, to become this ugly, this cruel? No, you're way better than that. Sorry to preach at my American friends, but you are. You're a city on a hill. You're one of the most idealistic countries on earth. You've done so many good things. You are better than this. And the reason I'm preaching at you is the things that you're doing to yourself, we're doing to ourselves and copying you. Like Brexit, all of this stuff, we're copying you. And it's so sad. It's so sad. It's so destructive of everything that's good in your society and everything that should be good in ours. And it comes back to insane ideas about economics, about what the public good is, about what makes our lives better. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but you can.
All really important thoughts. One thing that strikes my mind as you talk about America, Alexis de Tocqueville was this French aristocrat who came to the United States in the 1800s, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. But the thing that stood out to me as I read his book, Democracy in America, is he said, we're at war with ourselves in this really dangerous way because we care about, or at least we did care about, the permanent things, and really conserving our land and our ecology for the next generation. We had some good methods of stewardship in those generations and some good ideas around agrarianism, at least, although he is also a staunch critic of slavery in the South. But the thing he said that would be our downfall was our individualism and our desire for money. And he really believed that at some point, if we didn't keep that in check, that strong individualism and that focus on always growing and always getting greater profit, that it could lead American agriculture in a very dangerous direction. And so I think you're just seeing and kind of identifying some of those things. We've heard, so this is a question.
Sorry, forgive me. Can I say what? Go on, I'm going to say one more thing. I don't know how this would ever happen in reality, but if you don't care about where your food comes from, you're crazy. Like, every community in the world should send at least some of its people once a year to go to the places that are feeding them, literally the fields, and ask some pertinent questions. Like, where's your soil organic matter at? Like, send somebody that knows, right? And is this sustainable beyond the next 10 years? What is this doing to water courses and our rivers and our groundwater? What's this doing to human health? Can you make a living doing that in a way that's sustainable so that in the future I can carry on eating your food? Do we have food trust and food security if something really bad happens? Now, we've just had the COVID thing, right? I don't know what the hell happened there, but that's not the worst thing that's ever going to happen to us. Like, whatever that did to the food system, you need to start thinking about that plus 10, that times by 10. And we're not. We're idiots. We're like teenagers driving a Ferrari with a blindfold on. It's going to hit something. And we're not smart about this at all. And the idea that these money people just tell us to stop worrying, like, it's fine, we've got this. No, they don't have this. They're just a bunch of hustlers. Absolute hustlers. Sorry, let's do the questions.
No, I love it. Getting out there and looking at the land is important. So we have heard politicians say that any public money in the form of subsidy to farmers should deliver, quote, public goods. Do you think the idea of public goods is frightening to farmers who are very protective of their own farmland? And can you offer any reassuring suggestions to farmers about what they can do that might be seen as a public good?
So I totally believe that farmers deliver more than the things they sell, right? They just do. I could sell you a ton of grain from a field, but around that is a whole package of other things I destroyed or I made better. And those are public goods. They are value to the rest of us. So I'm going to make no apology for it. If the public will pay properly for public goods, I'll champion that all day long. I will help you to clean the river up. I'll help you to take carbon out of the atmosphere. I'm totally here for it. All I need is to know what you want, what you pay for it, and for that to be a viable undertaking at my end of that deal. It's simple. And nearly, I would say 40% of the farmers I know, they'll sign that piece of paper tomorrow. They'll deliver it. They'll earn money. They're not completely fixed on just being food producers. They'll do the things that we do. And then there's probably another 20-30% of farmers, if they see it working, they'll come along pretty much soon after. And then you have some diehard dinosaurs that don't care about anything outside of the primary product. And that's fine. We'd fix the world without them, to be honest. So I think it's the way that we have to go. We've got to stop pretending that what a supermarket pays for things is the only way to make our rural landscapes work. And I do believe in it. I don't completely despair of the state. I think the state as an actor in North America and in Britain is now wildly incompetent, but it doesn't mean that the state has to be wildly incompetent. I've been to lots of other places, particularly in Scandinavia, where the assumptions are very different. The assumption is that smart boys and girls will go to work in local or national government, that their skills and their management levels will be very strong, and they'll do things very competently. And guess what? When you believe that, you get that. So we're like the 1980s are playing out now in our lives, where we said, government gets everything wrong, and then we have governments that do everything wrong. It's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I believe in the public goods thing, and that requires you to somewhere in this chain, you need either a private or a state mechanism that will be there for a considerable period of time that can organize this and pay for it. Now, we don't need to get too hung up about exactly what that is, but you need that. And we're talking about it in the UK, and we've delivered it a little bit, but we haven't got the full system in place. And that's tragic, I think, given them what we need.
So another question, Wendell Berry has been mentioned a lot in this conversation. How has Berry particularly influenced you, James? And secondly, does Wendell Berry have an influence in the broader UK farming community?
So let's do that in reverse. I managed to get into my 30s before I'd even heard of him, as I said earlier. I don't think, maybe 1 in 10 British farmers might have heard of him, probably because people like me bag on about it quite a lot. Most haven't, so he's not a towering sort of intellectual figure in their minds. One of the nice spin-offs of my book success here has been that my editor then started to publish Wendell Berry, because I just kept telling her all the time, I'm like, why has nobody heard of this? Like, everyone should be reading it. So I've been able to help a little bit. Since I was 2/3 of the way through English Pastoral when I started reading some of Wendell's work on the same subject, that was mildly depressing. I have to tell you that somebody else worked it out 50 years ago. But we were clearly brothers in arms, if you like. And I've stayed at Wendell and Tanya's farm in Kentucky. And I actually stayed there the night that Trump was elected, which was a very strange experience because they were very sad. And we'd become friends. And one of the weirdest moments in my life where I realized that I was being overhyped was that Wendell interviewed me in Louisville Public Library. And all I kept thinking was, why is the cleverest person I know interviewing me and not the other way around? But he was very modest and humble about it. So I think, for me, the deeply heroic thing about him is how soon he figures it out and how fundamentally he realizes those lessons, what's wrong. Like, none of us can do that. Lots of us can write about this moment right here now, but he's forever the guy that sees it quickest, or one of the people that sees it quickest, along with people like Rachel Carson. Yeah, quite a remarkable thing, really. And I think, and it's the particular nature of Wendell, that sort of deeply Christian, deeply decent, dare I say it, sort of somewhere between American liberalism and American conservatism. He sort of sits, and I think you perhaps have to be him to see the world in exactly that way. But once read, once heard, you've got two choices: either he's right or he's wrong. And for me, he's fundamentally right about 80% of that.
Mm-hmm. Another question: rural Britain has for many years become the retirement haven for the urban middle class, much to the disruption of rural life. What can be done to stop this tide of rural erosion, and what can be done to rejuvenate the rural economy?
So it keeps coming back to Wendell. Wendell called this a long time ago. We act as if rural doesn't matter. We act as if farming doesn't matter, that these are sort of somehow anachronistic, they don't matter. I happen to believe that food production is probably one of 3 or 4 fundamental things that a society has to get right to be a healthy society. I mean, if for no other reason than civilizations die when they exhaust their soil, you have to be a lunatic in historical terms to be destroying your soil. So I think a really healthy Britain, a really healthy America, requires a lot of farmers and a lot of hands-on farmers, and frankly, a lot less monoculture. a lot less mechanized, simplistic agriculture producing 2 or 3 or 4 products, and a much more diversified whole diet agriculture. And frankly, we need about twice as many farmers as we have now, because that isn't stuff you do with a big tractor or a huge combine. That's stuff you start to do with your hand or at a human scale. But I don't see that as a backward step. When I talk to my daughter and young people now, I see a lot of those people searching for meaning, searching for a good life, trying to work out how they live in the places that they're from. And if you can tell me anything more important, maybe apart from teaching, nursing, maybe protecting us, defense, I guess, sometimes matters in a world with bad people. Feeding people's got to be one of those things, right? Like, how is that not one of the most noble, decent, dignified things that a human can do? So, and I'm absolutely convinced that when we get serious about fossil fuels and climate change, we're going to have to get serious about relocalizing food. It just doesn't make any sense to be moving things vast ways around the world. So we're going to have to start thinking about what people historically ate in our areas and what's the best way now to produce the things that we need to eat to be healthy. And I think there are going to be absolutely massive opportunities for younger, smaller, more diverse new entrants to agriculture. I really believe in that. I believe in urban food production that does that, and I believe in small farm organic food production, no-till, particularly horticulture in rural areas. I think it's going to be such a powerful thing about how we get out of the mess that we've got into.
So one final question. How much does constant pressure from food retailers stop farmers from farming in a more sustainable?
It's everything, right? So I have a lot of farming friends that are just realists, right? So I grew up with them. I can have a beer with them. I can watch some sport with them. In every other way, if we're not talking about how to run a farm, in every other way, you'd say these are good people, decent people. They pay their taxes. They're good parents. They help the school. They clear the road of snow. Good people. They're all over rural England, rural America. But their businesses are now becoming pretty ugly things sometimes, ugly and destructive things. And if you have the conversation with them and you're like, why? How does somebody as smart, as good as you do this? It's simple. They can see no other way. Like, by the time you have like 4 million, 6 million pounds borrowed from the bank to build a big dairy farm, you have to have 500 cows or 1,000 cows or 2,000 cows. Then you have to highly mechanize it. So you borrow another £1 million to put robots in to milk them. And then guess what? You can only sell your milk to 2 or 3 companies. They all pay the same price because they look at each other. There's nowhere to go. And then the supermarket says, not only are we going to dictate the price to you, so you make almost nothing after investing £6 million, we're gonna give your stuff away beneath the cost of production to encourage shoppers to come into our shops, and you can pay for the advert, thanks. Like, what is that? So you can, and I get frustrated with my environmentalist friends because they're preaching at that farmer saying, why are you doing this? And I'm like, what would you do? Like, you go and sit in their seat, you go and sign the checks, and you show me what you would do, because I don't know. It isn't that we don't have any moral agency or we shouldn't step up and try and break out of those things. We absolutely should. But I also have a huge amount of personal empathy for how you can get trapped in it. Before I came up here, I turned the TV on briefly, and the supermarkets were all bragging about how they'd got their prices down to the same level as each other. And then my wife, Helen, pointed out that everything that they have in the adverts are primary products, right? It was things that came off farms. It wasn't anything that they'd processed. It wasn't anything that they'd spent money adding value to. It was all the stuff that they could give away that other people produced. The thing is corrupt. And when people ask me how you solve this big mess that we're in, definitely one part of it is you need you probably need to break up the power of those large companies. Like America used to be a place that did that, right? You had antitrust stuff, you had anti-monopoly stuff. You knew that over concentration of economic power was as dangerous as over concentration of political power. You need laws and regulations and an ombudsman and you need a whole bunch of mechanisms to make sure that we're not abusing people, particularly rural people. And it's become a theme of this talk where, like, Wendell Berry talks about agriculture as almost like a sort of economic colonialism, like rural America is only there to be exploited. And I think it's true. And I think that's what this economic system does. And I also believe it doesn't have to be like that. I've been to lots of places around the world where they use the law, they use politics differently, and it doesn't have to be like that. But where, I think you said earlier, or de Tocqueville had said it, we're our own worst enemies. Particularly since the 1980s, we've begun to tell ourselves that this is the only way that the world can work, that any other way is weird or intrusive or socialist or foreign. Like and those are not historically American or British ideas. Those are very much ideas since the 1980s. They're the ideas of Milton Friedman and people like that.
One final question. What is on your desk, or what are you reading right now? What books are interesting to you?
That's a good.
There's a whole stack
of I'm a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan. I think he's amazing. He's a fantastic writer about what you were and what you could be again, isn't he? Like a sort of deeply humanist version of what America is at its best. I just read this book about Ukraine, about a little town in Ukraine where the Russian army turned up at the height of the sort of furthest reaches of their invasion. And that's a really good little book. A Small Stubborn Town, it's called. And then the best book I've read for a very long time was last week. I read a book called My Friends by a man who is my friend, actually, called Hisham Matar, who's this extraordinary Libyan British writer. I think sometimes he's described as a Libyan American writer because he works in New York. Just an extraordinary book. And yeah, I probably have, as you well know, I've got two passions in my life. One is fixing my landscape with my friends and like my family. And then the other one is books, really. I absolutely live for books. I did long before I ever wrote them and do now. Can I tell you one funny thing about Roger Scruton?
Mm-hmm.
When I was young, one of the first jobs I ever had off the farm was as a copy editor at a magazine. And Roger Scruton sometimes wrote for the magazine. And I, as a junior copy editor, sometimes used to copy edit his pieces for the magazine. They were about rural issues and fox hunting and things like that. And I didn't really know who Roger Scruton was at that time. But occasionally I'd be changing his prose, but I don't think he ever knew that.
I love that. We've come full circle now and back to his work. It's interesting because he wrote a lot about kind of architecture and the built environment as well. And so in terms of thinking about Jane Jacobs and good neighborhoods, obviously the way that we built buildings mattered to him, as well as rural issues. So it's kind of interesting seeing all those things coalesce. I love that. Well, thank you so much, James. This has been such a delight, as always. Always learn new things and think about important questions when I get to talk to you or read your work. And so I really appreciate you taking the time out of a busy farm day and a busy day as a parent to join us.